Yeah, I'm talking about localization again. It's Just the Gems, I'm Brandon, and I want to talk about what it means to respect the original source material. Anti-localization people often use the word disrespectful when they talk about localizations that don't meet their standards for one-to-one translation of words and phrases from Japanese into English. It's been a while now, but back when Eiyuden Chronicle 100 Heroes came out, I saw so much controversy around localization choices. This tweet in particular has stuck with me. And because I can't get it out of my head, I've decided to make this your problem by creating another video about localization. But this time, we're getting into the nitty-gritty, and I'm calling out the specific bad faith arguments and all-around bad behavior I've seen in the community. The problem with trying to talk about this topic in a rational and non-tribal way is that it intersects with other issues plaguing nerddom, one of the biggest being gatekeeping. How does that relate? Keep watching, I promise it all comes together. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. My first exposure to Japanese culture was video games on the NES. I became hooked on them enough that 35 years later, I now spend an inordinate amount of time talking about them on the internet. So the thing is, a lot of JRPG fans are very much like me. They're guys in their late 30s, early 40s, and they also grew up in the ancient times. This was an era when things like video games and anime were extremely uncool. I mean, maybe you could play like Madden and still be cool, but Final Fantasy? Nah, man, you get a wedgie. And anime? Heck no. That was something we watched in secret in our rooms in the dead of night. And not just because some of it was decidedly not going to pass the parent content check. We kept it to ourselves and maybe to a select group of friends we were able to gather together amidst the wasteland that was school. We nurtured these experiences we had. We had to work for them. I remember having to go to the mall to the specialty media store and pay $30 in the late 90s for 2 episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion on VHS tape, which my dad promptly confiscated anyway, so that's just pure loss. But some people did even more extreme things to get their nerdy Japanese fix. They downloaded JRPG ROMs from the internet and used fan translation patches to understand enough of the game to get through it. They traded VHS tapes of anime still in Japanese with amateur subtitles amateurly applied. They gobbled up whatever they could get their hands on because this was the coolest stuff on the planet. And it was. I mean, my tastes have obviously evolved over the years, but I can look back at all the Japanese media I consumed when I was younger and think, yeah, most of that stuff is just genuinely good. But all us nerds knew there was something special about this stuff. And when something is special, we can instinctively want to protect it. Unfortunately, protecting it takes on very different meanings for different people. Here's the thing. The stuff we consumed, the stuff we thought made us so special because only we knew about it, only we understood how awesome it was, other people consumed it too. Even, and I know this might be a shock, but even girls.
Oh my.
And this isn't just something that hyper nerds missed growing up. I consider myself reasonably attuned to people, and I completely missed it. I don't know if I ever knew a girl growing up who played video games. I mean, I definitely did know girls who played video games, but I didn't know that they did. Does that make sense? They were there all along. We just didn't realize it. As time went on, video games started pushing more into the mainstream, and eventually so did anime. Nowadays, it seems like Japanese and other Asian media is like the biggest thing on the planet. So naturally, a lot of us finally felt comfortable coming out of hiding. That includes women who play games pretty much as often as men do and who like anime the same as guys too. A lot of guys in my demographic did not take this well, because in their minds, these new people and these women were just pretending to get into it because the stuff we liked was cool all of a sudden. It was popular to like it. Gamer girls were getting attention, and at the end of the day, that's all they want, right? Attention. They didn't realize that those people had always enjoyed this stuff. They just didn't talk about it, at least not with us. So naturally, in these guys' minds, these people over here were fakers. Fake gamers, fake fans. They couldn't comprehend any other explanation for all these new people being a part of their hobby. And since everyone was feeling much less like they needed to keep these likes a secret, they started talking about games and anime more publicly. When people talk about things, inevitably they're going to talk about things they like, but also, and maybe even more so, things they dislike. Women, being a different demographic from the nerds like me, had different life experiences, and as such, they had different things they liked and disliked. They might love the gameplay of Mario, but maybe they weren't super keen on Princess Peach always being a darn damsel in distress. Couldn't maybe a female character be the cool hero every now and then? And if she is, does she always have to have, like, gigantic bazongas? Can she be shaped like a normal person? This was very upsetting to the nerds. They started attacking women in video games and trying to force all these female video game fans back into the proverbial dungeon of shame where we had all spent the first half of our lives. Many of you will remember that by the name Gamergate. I'm not going to go into any specifics about that particular story. There are probably more minutes spoken about that on YouTube than you have minutes in your life, so you can find info about it easily. But this movement to force everyone else out of their hobby was in large part due to fear. They were and are afraid people that aren't like them are going to influence the creators of video games and anime. And honestly, it's kind of true. Women and other people have had an influence on video games and anime. In general, I think it's been for good, but these other folks don't agree with me, obviously. This is where gatekeeping comes in. Gatekeepers are fully invested in pushing out any ideas that they don't agree with. But it's not just political stuff that they get protective about, it's language itself. See, we're back to localization. I told you. It all comes back around. That's the art of the essay. I and men in my demographic grew up in a time when JRPGs and anime were translated by overworked, underpaid individuals who had nothing but a spreadsheet and a working knowledge of both Japanese and English at their disposal. You hear stories about Richard Honeywood having a ridiculously short amount of time to localize Xenogears. Stories like that are a dime a dozen from back then. Localization was just not taken very seriously by most companies. They assumed we'd take whatever crap they threw at us. And that's not even to say that the localizers themselves weren't good. Most of them were. But with limited time and resources, you can't squeeze blood out of a rock or whatever, right? Things just won't turn out well. And the same goes for anime. I mean, with anime, it wasn't just that localization teams were small and the turnaround was tight. It was more like, we just didn't get most of the shows that came out in Japan. If you were a giant North American otaku, you had to rely on fan subtitles in order to get your drug of choice. My point is this. We grew up accustomed to Japanese media sounding a certain way to our ears. Literal one-to-one subtitles and boring JRPG dialogue is what we cut our teeth on. It's part of the media we fell in love with. Our tolerance for it, or even our love for it, that's what shows we're true fans. It was around the time of Xenogears, actually, that things started to change on the JRPG localization front. Honeywell's experience on the game convinced the company they needed to make some big changes, and so they did. Slowly but surely, JRPG localization started to get much better. Up to a certain point, I think most of us nerds didn't really care. I don't even think I noticed. Changes were subtle. There were fewer glaring typos. Dialogue was still a little dry, but from time to time you'd start to see some real personality shining through. Times were changing, and like the proverbial frog being boiled in a pot of water, it was happening gradually enough that most didn't notice it until it was too late. And by too late, I mean JRPG localizations were legitimately good now. All of a sudden, dialogue didn't sound like it had had all the cleverness sucked out of it. It was shocking. This didn't sound like the games we loved growing up. This sounded good. Like originally made for English audiences good. And that was bad. Localization was merely answering the call of capitalism. If you want to make money, you have to appeal to as many people as possible. If you want your franchise to succeed, it needs to cast a wider net. And honestly, I think this scares some people. It scares them a lot. A wider audience means all those people they had already tried to force out of the fandom, and maybe even more than that. And who knows what kind of ideas they might bring to the conversation. So to keep the ideas out of the community, they need to keep the people out. And one great way to keep the people out is to make the media as unappealing to the masses as possible. If JRPGs or anime get too popular, there's no stopping these ideas from spreading. They cannot abide that, and so they rage against localization. as it's doing, in my opinion, the most to make the case for why JRPGs should be played by more and more people. I know I've personally gotten so many comments from people extolling the virtues of gatekeeping, and the Venn diagram of gatekeepers and people who hate localization is basically a big circle. It's all part and parcel of that subculture. But I think their perspective is misguided and largely self-defeating. They're actually suffocating the media they say they love so much. So I want to try and lay out arguments for why that is. Now, there are some who would argue that it's pointless to try and debate with people like this. And in general, I do kind of agree. Debating is largely a frivolous activity. It tends to do nothing except further drill everyone into the position they started with, and it ends with hurt feelings and regrettable tweets. So I'm not really thinking of this as a debate. You absolutely can and should feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but I'm not likely to enter into a back and forth on the issue with you. I'll say my piece, you say yours, and people can engage as they feel so led. I don't expect I'll change the minds of anyone who's hardline on the other side of this issue. But I want to present my side more for the people who haven't picked a team and fallen down hard on it yet. So with that, let's talk about why bad localizations, by my definition of bad, naturally, but why they're actually detrimental to the long-term existence of JRPGs in the West. There was a time back in the 80s and 90s when JRPGs could be made on a shoestring budget. Maybe a dozen people plugging away for 18 months could bring out masterpieces of the genre. As time went on and as technology got better, the scope of games increased exponentially. Games were a big industry, and with that evolution came enormous budgets and gigantic teams of developers. These changes were made with the assumption that the market was growing, and it was. But just because a market grows for a while doesn't mean it will always be growing. If quality suddenly takes a hit, people will stop buying. And if they stop buying, that means the end. It was becoming clear to Japanese publishers that they had a simply enormous potential audience in the West, and they could only ignore them at their peril. Now, to their credit, they didn't let this change too much about how they made their games. They still have all the awesome quirks that longtime Japanese media fans have come to love. But they knew they couldn't half-ass the product in the West anymore. They needed to whole-ass it, and that meant hiring people that knew what Western audiences expected. And by Western audiences, I don't mean people like me with my background. People like us, I'm sorry to say, guys, we're not all that important. We're a tiny piece of the pie, and they want as much as they can get their hands on. That tiny slice might have been excited for a game with a subpar localization that amounted to a barely understandable one-to-one translation of Japanese text into English, but most audiences would not. The market grew, and so expectations shifted. Japanese companies handed their games over to localization teams and trusted that those teams understood what would allow their game to sell to the biggest audience over here. The Japanese companies know that sometimes there will be cultural differences that might require a delicate touch, just as there would be in bringing a piece of Western media to Japanese audiences. An example. In the original localization of Final Fantasy VII, as Cloud, Tifa, and Barret are climbing the stairs in the Shinra building, Tifa calls Barret, I'm not going to say the word because I don't know if YouTube will ding me for it, the R slur, the R word. You know the word. Several of you have already typed it in the comments. Even at the time the localization was produced, I'd say the use of that word as a lighthearted play insult was probably borderline at best. But in the 2020s, it's downright unacceptable. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, Tifa decidedly does not call Barret the R word on the stairs of the Shinra building. I saw some people very upset by this change because they saw it as once again woke localization editors imposing their beliefs on a piece of Japanese media. But here's what you have to understand if you want to begin to know how localization actually works. You have to understand that words have meanings. Sometimes those meanings are very simple, just basic descriptors of a thing. I say tree. You know what I'm talking about. There's nothing more to the word tree than that. A word like the R word, on the other hand, has a deep and complex web of meaning that is not easily broken down. Someone using that word is going to find themselves viewed by people a certain way. And I'll just be honest, in the modern day West, if you use that word casually as an insult, you're viewed negatively. I know maybe you and your friends say it to each other and you don't view yourselves as bad. That's fine, whatever. But the general population views that as a distasteful thing to do. If Tifa, the character in Final Fantasy VII Remake, said that word to Barret in the year 2020 in the West, she would be viewed negatively. If the intent of the original author was to show Tifa in a negative light, to say something negative about her personality, then sure, that might be a good word for her to use. But that was definitely not the intent. So even if that word might technically be a good one to use on a basic one-to-one translation level, it would absolutely destroy the character, and thus it's the wrong word to use. Imagine having to consider things like that for every single line of dialogue in a story that takes 80 hours to complete. The amount of work is mind-boggling. You have to have a deep understanding not only of your own culture, but of Japan's. You have to understand that a character apologizing when they enter someone's house is a purely cultural thing and doesn't make sense in English, and then find a way to communicate the idea of that without it sounding weird. Things like that in video games and anime are so pervasive that a lot of us longtime fans are used to them. We don't even really notice them anymore. But to a new audience member, things like that stick out like a sore thumb. And so a good localizer is doing their best to find ways of conveying the same ideas in a way that will be both understandable and appealing to a Western audience. And speaking of appealing, like I said at the beginning, the seed for this video was an old tweet about Eiyuden Chronicle 100 Heroes. It pointed out various localization choices and held them up against a literal translation of the original text. And naturally, it called the localization choices disrespectful. They presented a scene featuring a character rubbing a lens. The character says, "You got a lens, Noah?" "Well, ladies and gentlewolves, so do I." This is compared to the one-to-one translation, which reads, "Oh, you've got a lens too, Noah?" "And I." The official localization proceeds thusly. "Rub-a-dub-dub, don't be a flub." "There, did you see the glint?" Compared to the one-to-one translation. "Look, come on, come on, come on." There, you could see it for a moment, right? The one-to-one dialogue has a ring of familiarity to it, right? It sounds like how video games used to be localized. They took dialogue from Japanese and translated it to English. What that gives us is dry, boring language. In Japanese, this character is being quirky and energetic. What we get with the one-to-one is as close to the opposite of that as you can get. It does an absolute disservice to the original text, in fact, because it strips it of all the energy it had in Japanese. One Twitter user replied to this thread saying, "Why can't they translate the meaning without injecting the Western sensibilities where they do not apply? I guess that's too hard." The official localization does make some choices here. "Ladies and gentlewolves, rub-a-dub-dub." You are, of course, free to dislike those choices, but this is a localization that is closer to the intention of the original Japanese. But even if it wasn't, even if the localizers were inserting Western sensibilities into the script in a way that deviated from the intent of a particular scene in some small way, that's okay. I would even say that's good in some cases, because again, the reason Japanese publishers hand these games over to localization teams is because they trust that these teams know what is going to be appealing to the target audience, which in this case is Western players. The original writers wrote something presumably good for the Japanese audience, but even if they wrote something bad, it's still the job of the English localization team to make something good. It's why they were hired. It's the reason we're getting more and more games these days that in the past would have been locked to Japan forever. Because strong localizations bring in more money for the Japanese companies, which lets them create more games. And they're incentivized to bring them to the West because the way we present the games in the West is finally on par with the way they present the games in Japan. I can understand and respect the need for something of a middle ground, though. There is a good argument that can be made about some forms of localization essentially erasing the original intent or even full-on erasing the culture, sort of whitewashing media to make it palatable. Now, like I said, I'm honestly more or less okay with localization sanding off the edges that are going to cut our cultural sensibilities when and if those things come up, like eliminating a boob size slider from a character creator that lets you make what for all appearances are underage girls. Maybe that's seen a bit differently in Japan, I don't know. I have a feeling plenty of them are weirded out by it too. But over here, that's like, we don't play that. We just don't. But I'm getting off topic. My point is, yes, there probably needs to be a middle ground. The classic example of rice balls turning into jelly donuts in Pokemon, you know. I can see how the localizers felt kind of backed into a corner. This was an era when Japanese culture was still extremely unknown in the West, and it's not like the dialogue expended any effort in explaining what rice balls were, since it was originally written for a Japanese audience that would absolutely know what those things were. Still, I think nowadays it would be seen as more acceptable to refer to them as rice balls. There's more cultural awareness today. But that cultural awareness only became possible because Japanese media was brought to the West in a form we could easily digest. Generations of kids became interested in the culture that brought them their favorite video games and cartoons, and because of that, future titles don't need as much massaging, for lack of a better term. Good localization begets better localization. Anytime there's a culture war brewing, you can bet there are an army of grifters waiting in the wings to capitalize on it. These are people that might not even have a personal stake in the outcome. A lot of grifters in this situation are like that. Some are into these games or into games in general, but it doesn't make them any less a grifter just because they have more to gain from riling people up. So they observed the grievance that many in the old-fashioned nerd cohort felt, and they amplified it. They made it about more than it originally was so they could raise the temperature as high as possible. We love to engage with content that makes us mad. That's a weird quirk of human nature. And so these grifters ended up elevated to the point where they were loud enough they could influence the entire group. The grifters don't care about JRPGs or anime. They care about making money, and they know they can make a lot of it off you if you're angry. If someone online frames their argument about video games around terms like DEI or woke, or even mentions Sweet Baby Inc., there is almost a 100% chance they are trying to grift you. Not all grifts are created equal, of course. Like, some of them just want attention. Some of them, like famed Twitter provocateur and anti-charisma activist Mark Kern, aka Grums, likely want to turn your attention into dollars eventually when their anti-woke game studios finally release a game. You might not be getting scammed in the traditional sense because they're not literally taking your money, except for Grums with his Kickstarter studio thing from 10 years, 14 years ago. They haven't made a game yet. Come on, guys. But they are taking something from you. And I'd argue it's even more valuable than money. They're taking your time and they're taking your interest and weaponizing it against you. You don't have to fall for it. You can ignore them. Let me speak directly to any people from that old-fashioned nerd group who might still be watching. Look, I get it. I'm an old nerd too. I grew up with this stuff. I was made fun of for liking this stuff. I had girls tell me I was an ugly loser dork because of the things I was into. I had guys tell me that too, if we're being honest. I also know what it's like to love something and think the only way to protect it is to keep it exactly the same. But just like a child eventually grows into a teenager and then an adult, change is just something that's going to happen. The only way you can stop it is if you suffocate it. And it just occurred to me that if I'm using a child as the metaphor, then suffocating is a really dark place to take this. But you get what I mean, right? Clamping down on the thing you love in the effort to keep it from changing isn't going to work. It's going to stifle it until it dies. If the audience for the things we love don't continue to grow, those things are not going to be around for long. If you personally don't like how modern localizations sound, if you like that old-time sound of bad localization because it's comforting to you, nostalgic, that sort of thing, I get that. That's actually fine. If you're honest about that, I can even respect it. But when it comes to respect, you have to understand that localizers are showing the most respect to the original material by adapting it for its audience. All localization is adaptation. It just is. It's how language works. I would really encourage you to try learning a language, like start learning Japanese. It's easier than ever to do nowadays, and it will do wonders for helping you understand why one-to-one translation is almost never going to convey complicated ideas properly. If you're open to considering that, thank you. If you're not, if you understand that better writing means a bigger audience and you hate that with a passion, let me ask you this. Who's the real JRPG fan? The person who wants JRPGs to grow and thrive and reach more and more people? Or the people who are actively rooting for the death of the genre? That's all for now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks to everyone who subscribes. I really appreciate you. Thanks, as always, to my members for supporting me and the channel and for generally just being awesome. Check out my podcast, the JRPG Pursuit. We talk about JRPGs every single week. Link is in the description. See you later.